All right, so in this video, we're going to be continuing with Unit 7 Natural Selection, talking about phylogeny. Phylogeny is a fancy word for evolutionary history, and we're going to look at the different ways that phylogeny can be showed. Um, there's phylogeny, and this is basically showing all living things on this phylogenetic tree, which is phylogenetic tree is basically a diagram that shows evolutionary relationships. It typically has a time component to it too. You can see the length of the lines typically show how far back things are or how old things are. And so there's a time component here. It's usually based upon a biochemical sort of thing or fossil relationships. And so phylogenetic tree serves a purpose in talking about evolutionary history. And another type of diagram is called a cladogram. And a cladogram is involves something called a clade. And a clade is basically any group that shares a common ancestor. And so you can choose that group and then create a cladogram for it. For instance, this cladogram shows it looks like just a general vertebrate cladogram here. And so it shows, and notice what else is going on here. It has a group of these traits here, and these traits are called derived traits. These derived traits or these derived characters are shared by the common ancestor and all of its descendants. And so here, for instance, is this derived trait may be just the fact that everything here is a vertebrate, right? And so you can go out this way to the lamprey, or you can go this way. And that shows you that everything in the tree essentially is a vertebrate. Well, once you go up this ladder to the right and up, you have jaws. Well, lamprey don't have jaws, right? But everything else does. And so once you go up, you have this concept of having four limbs or tetrapods. Fish aren't tetrapods, but everything else is. You get the idea. And so they each, the cladogram and the phylogenetic tree, each have their own uses. One more thing on the cladogram too is most cladograms will include a group called the outgroup, and the outgroup is typically doesn't belong to that clade, but serves as kind of a basis of comparison. It's similar to a control in a controlled experiment. Serves as kind of a basis of comparison to the whole group. This one really doesn't have an outgroup. The outgroup that you might include for something like this would be like an echinoderm, maybe like a starfish or something like that. That's not a vertebrate, but it's close. Has some of the defining characters, but not all of the. Not a chordate, or you may just use a primitive chordate like an amphioxus or something along those lines. So that just gives you an idea. Um, these diagrams also show where speciation occurs. So you can use that more on a phylogenetic tree where you have different species that are occurring. For instance, here you have Pteropus. Oh, I'm not going to pronounce these, but back here, so these two species are related back here, right? And these two species are related to these two species back here. And this branch or this node is where those two lines meet, and that represents what we would call a common ancestor between those two species. There's lots of different ways that these phylogenetic trees can be drawn, and lots of different ways that they can be constructed. And typically, how they are constructed is by the um, construction of a table like this, where you pick out the traits that you want to measure your cladogram against, and then you decide which one has them. And so notice here's a picture. You have all these different groups here, different vertebrates, and so everything has a vertebra. If you were going to have an outgroup in this, it'd be something that didn't, like an amphioxus would be an example, or like a something along those lines. Um, a tunicate would be another one. And that would be your outgroup. Didn't have any of these traits. Well, everything has a vertebra, but not everything has four limbs, right? And so the fish only shares one thing in common with everything else, and so it's going to go further back on the evolutionary thing, whereas the frog is next. And then the gorilla, according to this, doesn't have eggs, but it does have hair and fur, so it only shows 4. And so you would need to use these clues to construct. Notice the bird and the lizard share that, and so the bird and the lizard are more closely related than the gorilla, or than they are to the gorilla and the rodent, but they're more closely related. All of them are more closely related to each other than they are to the frog, and you get the idea. And so you can use this table to construct a phylogenetic tree or a cladogram that looks something like this, right? Fish in the back, amphibians here. You have the egg, which is the birds and reptiles are really closely related to one another, right? But they don't share a recent common ancestor with amphibians, but more so with rodents and primates with that amniotic egg. You're like, well, primates and rodents don't lay eggs. Well, they have an internal egg, like the placenta, right? But they do have hair and fur, which is where they're going to show their relationship. And so you can use a table like this to construct a phylogenetic tree, and it's helpful because you're going to see diagrams like this, and having an understanding of how they're constructed will actually help you answer questions about them, and you'll see a lot of this sort of thing on the AP exam.